Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Andrew Fienberg, who is Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Technology in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, where he directs the Applied Communication and Technology Lab. He has taught for many years in the philosophy department at San Diego State University and Duke University, the State University of New York at Buffalo, the University of California, San Diego in Irvine, the Sorbonne, and other institutions. He is the author of Lukács, Marx, and the Sources of Critical Theory from Rowman and Littlefield, 1981, Critical Theory of Technology from Oxford, 1991, Alternative Modernity from University of California Press, 1995, and Questioning Technology from Routledge, 1999. He's also author of Heidegger and Marcuse, The Catastrophe and Redemption of History, and Between Reason and Experience, Essays in Technology and Modernity, which appeared with MIT in 2010. Many other publications, and so he has been just a great voice in critical theory because he has developed so much of his thought through thinking through the first generation, and particularly for me, very importantly so, via Lukács and Marx, who have been such important figures. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Fienberg.
So, let's see. Thank you, Rocio, and thank you especially for organizing this conference and inviting me to participate in it. I'm really pleased to be here and to have all of you as my audience for this talk. I'm probably one of the few, if not the only, member of the critical theory gang who still works on the first generation technology problematic. And this has resulted in me doing a lot of work with social science. So the latest book, Between Reason and Experience, has a number of examples drawn from the history of technology. This is one of the reasons why there are slides, because social scientists have to have slides, otherwise they feel naked. So when I go to their conferences, I show off my slides. So I brought some here, and I thought it might be useful since this is a very condensed exposition of a book, a new book, called The Philosophy of Praxis, Marx, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School. This new book is actually a very radical revision of that first one published over 30 years ago. So in 30 years, I learned a few things, and the result is that I recast the argument. And this book on reason and experience got me to thinking much more clearly about the dependence of everything I've done on technology, on that early first book and its account of reification, which is really at the basis of all the Frankfurt School discussions of, at least in the first generation, of technology. The theme tends to disappear after 1969, but I'll try and bring it back. So, okay, let me read then the paper. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes. In 1844, Marx wrote that philosophy can only be realized by the abolition of the proletariat, and the proletariat can only be abolished by the realization of philosophy. Adorno later commented, philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. What is the meaning of this strange concept of a realization of philosophy? The purpose of this talk is to sketch an answer to this question, which is more fully developed in my forthcoming book entitled The Philosophy of Praxis, Marx, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School. Gramsci used the phrase philosophy of praxis as a code word for Marxism in his prison notebooks. It has come to signify interpretations of Marxism that follow his lead in situating all knowledge in a cultural context, itself based on a class-specific worldview. Gramsci called this absolute historicism. It characterizes the Hegelian Marxism of Marx's early work, Lukács, Korsch, Bloch, and the Frankfurt School. I will refer to this trend as philosophy of praxis to distinguish it from other interpretations of Marxism. The philosophy of praxis holds that fundamental philosophical problems are in reality social contradictions, abstractly conceived. These contradictions appear as practical problems without solutions, reflected in cultural dilemmas. Philosophy treats them as theoretical antinomies, insoluble conundrums over which the thinkers struggle without reaching a convincing solution or consensus. They include the antinomies of value and fact, freedom and necessity, individual and society, and ultimately subject and object. Traditional philosophy is thus theory of culture that does not know itself as such. Philosophy of praxis does know itself as cultural theory and interprets the antinomies accordingly as sublimated expressions of social contradictions. This argument has two implications. On the one hand, philosophical problems are significant insofar as they reflect real social contradictions. On the other hand, philosophy cannot resolve the problems it identifies, because only social revolution can eliminate their causes. As Marx says in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. But as we will see, the change envisaged by philosophy of praxis encompasses nature as well as society, creating new and puzzling antinomies. The most developed version of this argument is Lukács's notion of the antinomies of bourgeois thought. Hegel claimed that the fundamental task of philosophy is overcoming the antinomies and reconciling their poles. Lukács accepted Hegel's view, but argued that this is not a speculative task. The antinomies arise from the limitations of capitalist practice, its individualistic bias and technical orientation, which he calls reification. They cannot, therefore, be resolved theoretically. Consider the antinomy of value and fact. Philosophy has struggled with this antinomy ever since scientific reason replaced Aristotelian teleology. Most modern philosophers have tried to rationally justify moral values so as to avoid their reduction to mere preferences, despite their expulsion from nature by modern science. Lukács argued that this procedure is misguided. The underlying problem is the dominant understanding of rationality and the corresponding concept of reality in capitalist society. Science exemplifies these categories for philosophy, but they have a social origin in the structure of market relations and the capitalist labor process. It is in this context that values appear opposed to a reality defined by obedience to economic laws indifferent to humanity. So far, the argument appears relativistic and reductionist, but Lukács reached the startling conclusion that a transformation of social reality can alter the form of rationality and the nature of reality, and thus resolve the antinomy. I call this a metacritical argument. It takes the abstract concepts of value and fact, grounds them in their social origin, and then resolves the contradiction at that level. Lukács applied this approach to the fundamental antinomy of subject and object. His argument has three moments. First, sociological desublimation of the philosophical concept of the subject, which, from its idealistic definition as transcendental cogito, is redefined as a living and laboring human being. Second, reconceptualizing the relation of the desublimated subject to the objective world in accordance with the structure of the cognitive subject-object relation in idealist philosophy. Third, resolving the antinomies that arise in this context through projecting a revolution in the relations of the desublimated terms. Metacritique in this sense underlies the philosophy of praxis. The four philosophers I discuss in this talk develop the metacritical argument under specific historical conditions. Differences in these conditions explain much of the difference between them, since philosophy of praxis depends on a historical circumstance, the more or less plausible revolutionary resolution of the antinomies. Marx first proposed a consistent version of the philosophy of praxis. He wrote at the beginning of the proletarian movement in a backward society with a sophisticated philosophical culture, conditions that favored a broadly speculative conception of the future. He projected a total revolution, transforming not only society, but also experience and nature. He dismissed modern science, this is in his early work, as alienated and promised a new science uniting man and nature, subject and object. The rather fantastical quality of these speculations gave way to a sober scientific analysis of capitalism in later works that restrict the argument to political economy. The early Marx sought a resolution of the antinomies through revolution. His concepts of the subject as a natural being, of objectification of human faculties through labor, and of the revolutionary overcoming of capitalist alienation correspond to the three moments of metacritique. From this perspective, the manuscripts of 1844 appear as a historicized ontology with a normative dimension. They promise the realization of philosophy in social reality. Though Marx's argument begins with an analysis of the place of revolution in political philosophy. Revolution has been justified in modern times either on the grounds that the existing state is an obstacle to human happiness or because it violates fundamental rights. So Locke and Rousseau say. There are thus both teleological and deontological grounds for revolution. Marx introduced an original deontological ground, which he called the demands of reason. Idealism originally formulated these demands as the unity of thought and being, subject and object. The early work developed the argument in three stages. Marx started out from the antinomy of moral citizenship in the bourgeois state versus economic need in civil society. Citizen and man are moved by completely different and conflicting motives, the one by universal rational laws, the other by individual advantage. In a first stage, Marx showed the importance of transcending this opposition, but did not explain how needs can be harmonized and universalized to overcome their competitive nature. He argued next that the proletariat is the agent of revolution and as such tasked with resolving the antinomy of man and citizen. But since he did not clarify the relation of reason to need, this argument creates a new antinomy of Marxist theory and proletarian praxis. Has the proletarian revolution anything to do with Marx's project? What sort of practical material motivation in society would correspond with Marx's philosophical goals? And when he says that the proletariat philosophy is the head and the proletariat the heart, you wonder how the head and the heart get together. The third phase of the argument answered these questions with a metacritical deconstruction of the antinomy of reason and need. The key to understanding Marx's manuscripts is their radical redefinition of need as the ontologically fundamental relation to reality. Let's see, is that the right one? Yeah. If need rather than knowledge is fundamental, the claims of idealist philosophy to derive being from the thinking subject are overturned. But Marx did not simply reject the idealist formulation. On his ontological account, need is not accidentally related to the natural means of satisfaction, but is essentially correlated with nature. He says needs are ontological affirmations. That correlation is lived out in work, which objectifies human faculties in nature while fulfilling needs. This is the true unity of subject and object, similar in form and function to idealism's cognitive unity. The liberation of the subject of need from the law of the market thus satisfies the demands of reason and grounds Marx's revolutionary critique of the alienation of labor. The antinomies are overcome in history, not just the antinomy of man and citizen, which emerged from the first essays on politics that he wrote, but the ontologically fundamental antinomy of subject and object as well. But is this a plausible claim? The goal of idealist philosophy is to demonstrate the unity of subject and object by showing the constitution of the object by the subject. What happens to this ambition if subject and object are redefined as natural beings? In the context of philosophy of praxis, this gives rise to a new antinomy of society and nature. Can a living social subject constitute nature? Marx's manuscripts answer yes. Nature is reduced to a human product through labor and sensation, sensation understood as socially informed and thus constitutive of a specifically human dimension of the objective world. But surely nature existed before human beings and does not depend on them for its existence. Natural science studies this independent nature which appears as true reality. If this is so, history is an insignificant corner of the universe, and the human being is a merely natural fact without ontological significance. Naturalism is thus a central challenge to philosophy of praxis from the very start. Marx rejected it, arguing that if you imagine nature independent of human beings, you imagine yourself as questioner out of existence. There's a marvelous kind of koan in the middle of the manuscripts where he says, so you ask me, what is independent nature? So I say to you, imagine nature independent of you, and you imagine yourself out of existence. And at this point, you should achieve satori. In short, nature independent of human beings is a meaningless postulate, not a concrete reality. Marx condemned the view from nowhere as a leftover from the theological notion of a disembodied subject. His idea of nature was not that of modern natural science, which he considered a mere abstraction. His nature is experienced in need, perceived by the socialized senses, and mastered by labor. This lived nature has a historical dimension the nature of natural science lacks. Marx called for the creation of a new science of lived nature that encompassed that dimension. We will see that Lukács faced a similar challenge, although he solved it differently and, to my mind, more plausibly. Although Lukács' version of the philosophy of praxis has similarities to that of the early Marx, he was influenced primarily by Marx's later works. The manuscripts weren't published when he wrote History and Class Consciousness. His most important theoretical innovation, the concept of reification, combines Weber's theory of rationalization with Marx's critiques of the fetishism of commodities and mechanized labor. There is much confusion in the literature about the meaning of reification. According to its etymology, reification is the reduction of human relations to relations between things. The race is the thing in the Latin root. For Lukács, the word thing in this context has a specific meaning, an object of factual knowledge and technical control. So it's not entity in general. Reification is not a mental state, but constitutes the society through a specific pattern of beliefs and practices. Lukács, at this stage in his career, generally avoided the word culture, but reification belongs to what we would call the culture of capitalism. Writing at the time when invasive social rationalization threatened to overwhelm Europe, Lukács interpreted Marx's analysis of capitalist economic rationality as the paradigm and source of the modern conception of rationality as such. The economic limitations of capitalism are the model for Lukács' analysis of the limitations of rationality in every sphere. These limitations have to do with what Lukács calls formalism. Reified economic rationality is formal in the sense that it abstracts from the specific qualitative contents to quantitative determinants, for example, price. The form-content dialectic is played out in the contradiction between the abstract economic form of the worker as seller of labor power and his or her concrete life process, which overflows the boundaries of that form. The tension between form and content is not merely conceptual, but leads to crisis and revolution. The theory of reification thus builds a bridge between Marx's crisis theory and the intensifying cultural and philosophical crises of early 20th century capitalist society, all of which Lukács attributes to the formal character of modern rationality. Lukács developed this argument through a critical history of philosophy. Reified thought, as exemplified by Kant, takes the scientific relation to nature as the model of the subject-object relation. But just as capitalist economic rationality is correlated with a content it cannot fully embrace, much embraces a rationality modeled on science. With Kant, the contradiction of form and content is generalized to knowledge as such. The content that does not go into the formal concepts without remainder appears as the thing in itself. The antinomy of subject and object divides the knowing subject from ultimate reality. Kant's three critiques of pure and applied reason, let me make sure I'm in the right spot here. Kant's three critiques of pure and practical reason and aesthetic judgment correspond to the three attempts in classical German philosophy to resolve the antinomies of a formalistic concept of rationality. Three demands of reason emerge from this philosophical experience. First, the principle of practice, according to which only a practical subject can overcome the antinomy of form and content. Second, the identification of history with reality, because only in history is practice effective at the ontological level. Third, dialectical method, which overcomes the limitation of rational explanation to formal laws. Lukács organized his account of post-Kantian philosophy around the struggle to meet these three demands, which Marxism finally fulfills. Lukács argued that the metacritical desublimation of the concept of rationality in Marxism makes possible a resolution of the antinomies of classical German philosophy. Social antinomies, such as the conflict of value and fact, freedom and necessity, but also the ontological antinomy of subject and object exemplified by the thing in itself. The contradictions are resolved by an identical subject-object, for which knowledge and reality are one. The proletariat is this subject-object because in consciousness of its reified condition, qua mass of individual workers, it rises above that condition and transforms itself and the society through collective action. The revolution invoked by the third moment of the Metacritique satisfies the demands of reason. But the meaning of this argument is obscure. Is the proletariat a metaphysical agent, a constituting subject a la idealism, a version of the transcendental ego positing the existing world? Or does it, as I argue, mediate the meaning of reified social reality in a continuous process of which it is a part? I call this latter interpretation a methodological concept of revolution. It does not substantialize the proletariat, nor view de-reification as the achievement of a final unreified state of affairs. Rather, reified institutions and social relations produce collective subjects which contest the reified forms from within. This is a dilemma around which a permanent controversy over the meaning of Lukács's work has swirled. The disagreement is especially relevant to Lukács's considerations on nature and natural science, because it is here that the metaphysical interpretation leads to the most dubious consequences. I argue that Lukács is betrayed by his rhetorical references to idealism, but actually holds a much more plausible dialectical view. Here I come into diametrical conflict with the Frankfurt School's interpretation of Lukács. Tough. They'll have to take it or refute it. In fact, Lukács denied that nature in itself is constituted by historical practice. Is this an inconsistency? How then can the proletarian revolution resolve the antinomies if nature in itself lies beyond history? Lukács lived in an advanced society in which science and technology played an essential role. He could not envisage their total overthrow, as had the early Marx. He had to find a more subtle version of the revolutionary resolution of the antinomy of subject and object. For this purpose, he drew on the neo-Kantian distinction between meaning and existence. Reification is what he called a form of objectivity, a Gegenständlichkeitsform. That is, an a priori condition of meaning. This is not exactly a Kantian a priori, since it is enacted in social reality by human beings, rather than by an abstract subject that can never be an object. Nevertheless, it operates at the level of the intelligibility of the world, even as it plays a material role in the practical activities that constitute that world. Transposing the antinomy of subject and object to this level makes their reconciliation in a unity possible. On these terms, the subject need not posit the material existence of nature to overcome the antinomy. Instead, the question is reformulated in terms of the relation of the subject to the system of meanings in which the world is lived and enacted. That relation takes two different forms, which are in effect methods, both cognitive and practical. What Lukács called the contemplative method of natural science posits reified facts and laws. This term, contemplative, is confusing. Science is contemplative not because it is passive, but in the sense that it constructs the world as a system of formal laws that cannot be changed by de-reifying practice. Contemplative method produces truths about nature, Lukács affirms, but it is ideological in its social scientific application. Social institutions can be transformed ontologically by human action, which, in modifying their meaning, changes their actual functioning. Lukács claimed that a transformative relation to society is a condition for true knowledge of it. He called this the unity of theory and practice. This methodological distinction between contemplative and transforming practice is central to the argument. Both are social, although in different ways. All forms of knowledge depend on historically specific a priori constructions of experience. The nature of natural science is a product of one such cultural form, the contemplative form, and so belongs to history, even as it posits a world of facts and laws beyond the reach of historical practice. Lukács thus incorporated science into history through its a priori form of objectivity, not through the constitution of its factual content. The dualism of nature and society is methodological, not metaphysical, and is situated within a larger social framework. His theory thus satisfies the requirements of the philosophy of praxis. Okay, I turn now to the Frankfurt School. Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse wrote in the wake of the revolutionary tide that carried Lukács forward to communism. The Frankfurt School's critique of science and technology is a direct descendant of the theories of alienation and reification of Marx and Lukács. These philosophers agreed with Lukács that the capitalist construction of experience lies at the basis of the scientific worldview. The limitations of that worldview are manifest in the forms of rationalization characterizing modernity and the crises and pathologies they provoke. The Frankfurt School philosophers believed that socialism could resolve the antinomies in principle, but the revolutionary potential of the proletariat was in precipitous decline. In Adorno and Horkheimer, the historical thesis of the philosophy of praxis serves primarily to support uncompromising social critique. Even if the alternative is only an abstract possibility, the existing society can be judged by contrast with it. With Dialectic of Enlightenment, the focus shifts from class issues to the domination of nature and the structure of modern experience. This text criticizes the unbounded extension of instrumental rationality in modern societies. The underlying purpose of rationality is self-preservation. In modern times, nature, in the form of the instinctual struggle for survival, triumphs within the rational forms and twists them to destructive ends. This is the revenge of suppressed nature. The authors invoke the potential of reflective reason to reconcile humanity and nature through what they called mindfulness of nature in the subject. That is, through recognition of human limits, the fact that human beings belong to nature too. While he rejected the Lukácsian identical subject-object, Adorno's later concept of identity and non-identity recapitulate the form-content dialectic of reification. Identity thinking is formal. It impoverishes experience by identifying the experienced object with the abstract concepts that subsume it in thought, while erasing more complex connections and potentialities. The lost content is recaptured by the dialectical study of concrete experience. We can get a hint of what we miss from art and reflection. Adorno proposed a rational critique of rationality. He recognized the essential role of instrumental reason while resisting the exorbitant form it takes under capitalism. For example, he argued that the machine is both an oppressive instrument of capitalist domination and contains a promise of service to all humanity through its objective form. Deborah Cook made this point earlier in relation to exchange, and I mentioned here that Adorno made similar arguments in relation to the market and other modern institutions. The concept of formal bias I've introduced in my own critical theory of technology develops this aspect of Adorno's argument as a critical method for studying technology and other rationalized institutions. So now we're ready for Marcuse. Marcuse's philosophy of praxis was influenced not only by Marx, Lukács, and Horkheimer and Adorno, but also by Husserl and Heidegger. Marcuse shared Adorno's critique of instrumental reason, which he formulated in terms of what he called a two-dimensional ontology. Like Adorno's concepts of identity and non-identity, Marcuse's dimensions referred to the reified form of the object and its wider connections and potentialities blocked by the existing society. The phenomenological concepts of experience and life world are invoked to explain the flawed inheritance of science and technology and the promise of the New Left. Marcuse's metacritique of science and technology tied them to their source in the capitalist exploitation of human beings and the earth. Technological domination increasingly restricts experience and knowledge to their instrumental aspects. Revolution will transform the historically evolved a priori conditions of experience that emerged from the capitalist project. A new mode of experience, structured by a new a priori, will reveal potentialities intrinsic to its object, the second dimension. Just as reified technological rationality is derived from the life world of capitalism, so a radically different rationality is promised by this new mode of experience. A dialectical rationality will incorporate the imagination as the faculty through which the reified form of things is transcended. According to Marcuse, the new emancipatory form of experience relates to nature and other human beings non-instrumentally, as subjects, rather than reducing everything to raw materials in an exploitative project. Contrary to Habermas's famous critique, this does not imply conversational familiarity, but rather recognition of the integrity of the object as a substance with its own potentialities. In Marcuse, subject and object are united not through a totalizing objectification, as in Marx, or the unity of theory and practice, as in Lukács, but through shared participation in a community of nature. But the critique of technological rationality in Marcuse is ambiguous and requires significant revision. His concept of nature is unclear. Did he intend to re-enchant the nature of natural science, as Habermas claimed, or was his theory aimed at a reform of technological design? A clarification of Marcuse's rather confusing statements suggests that he was primarily concerned with the politics of technology, which must be redesigned to reflect the potentialities of both human beings and nature. Human subject and natural object will be reconciled in a world transformed in accordance with the potentialities of both. Marcuse reached more positive conclusions than Adorno, although he too found no effective agent of change. He argued that the New Left movements of the 1960s and 70s were not revolutionary agents, but that their new sensibility prefigured an emancipatory mode of experience. Revolution in an advanced society is at least a real possibility in Hegel's sense on this basis. Marcuse thus constructed a final version of the philosophy of praxis. The philosophy of praxis is significant for us today as the most developed attempt within Marxism to reflect on the consequences of the rationalization of society under capitalism. It was the first to raise fundamental philosophical questions about science and technology from a critical, dialectical standpoint. It attacked capitalism not at its weak points, such as inequality and poverty, but at its strongest points, the rationality of its markets and management techniques, its idea of progress, its technological efficiency. But it does not reject rationality as such. Rather, philosophy of practice dared to formulate a rational critique of rationality that identifies the flaws in modernity's rational achievements and proposes a rational alternative on a new basis. Okay, so that's the brief summary of my book, condensed down to a few pages. I'm sure you have many questions, and I'll be anxious to hear them.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions, Anita. And then
Thank you so much for both of those talks. They were really, really insightful and interesting. And I guess I wanted to ask Andrew a question. Thank you so much for speaking about Lukács. I'm always happy when that happens. I write about Lukács too. And I guess, I mean, you've presented these three, I think, distinct models of the philosophy of praxis. And I guess my question, well, I guess it's a general question about the philosophy of praxis, which is I didn't quite get exactly where you were standing on which resolution of the problems of theory and praxis that you were actually arriving at. And I guess more specifically with Lukács, my question, in terms of how you represented his resolution of the theory-praxis problem, is that, so my understanding of it is that Lukács is really saying that through a form of practical kind of knowledge, we can have a transformation in the nature not only of the proletariat's consciousness, but of the nature of capitalist reality itself. So at the end of reification in the consciousness of the proletariat, he's saying when the proletariat has knowledge of its own position as the self-identical subject-object, that knowledge is itself practical, right? It is not just a contemplative kind of knowledge. But here, where I find the problem in Lukács is just that I don't know that a problem of, or that a model of knowledge can actually continue to provide the basis for the transformation of the object that he's pointing to. And so I guess I was just wondering where you stand on that.
Well, I think you have to remember that he doesn't talk about knowledge. The proletariat doesn't have knowledge, it has consciousness or self-consciousness. So this is important because knowledge will always be a representation of some sort of reality, and therefore distance from it and not able to alter it directly, but only through, say, an application or what. But whereas the consciousness is different, because consciousness is something that happens in the world. It's not a representation of the world. And you have to remember that the whole argument, as I present Lukács, the whole argument turns on this notion of form of objectivity. So what is transformed by the consciousness of the proletariat is the form of objectivity of the proletariat. In the same sense in which in individual life, self-awareness may transform your relation to reality, right? Especially true in our relations to other people, right? But becoming aware of ourselves may alter the assumptions we make about others. In this case, it's a collective self-consciousness that transforms the proletarians into active agents, a collective agent of change of capitalism. So, but the change already occurs in the mere fact of becoming conscious, because the fundamental change is the change in the a priori form with which the society is apprehended. So that's the way I would interpret what Lukács is saying. Yeah.
Well, thanks to both of you. Very stimulating. I have questions for each of you. Jim, I'd like you to expand a little bit more on the immanence, transcendence critique, effectively, that you're making of Habermas. And in particular, I mean, I'm wondering what your view of the peace and security agenda of this new, more legalistic and universal global framework might be. I'm also wondering whether you can conceive of any kinds of checks and balances that, or whether Habermas has thought about this at all, that might be brought to bear, because we've seen the International Court of Rights serve the needs of certain nations, which will remain unnamed, and not serve the needs of other nations, so that it does seem to be controlled by a particular group, a dominant group of nations. Is there any way that could be problematized and maybe overcome? Whether there's been any thinking done on that. Have you read also, George Monbiot wrote a book, and the name is escaping me now, but it's on democracy and basically on creating a democratic form of government, building it from the ground up, like literally from us and everybody else. I would just be curious, because it's really a radical book, but it looks feasible to me. And to Andrew, thank you. I'd like to know a little bit more about where you see your work shifting in those 30 years. I'm also wondering, because you talk here about a shift from class to the domination of nature, whether or not Albina's distinction yesterday between the relational and the systemic might not be useful, because neither Adorno nor Marcuse denied the existence of classes. Just the feasibility of some kind of revolutionary action was problematized, and certainly the shift to the domination of nature, as you call it here, is really perhaps a shift to a more systemic viewpoint. And then finally, have we gone beyond revolution at this point? Looking at Foucault's critiques, for example, of revolution. I'm just wondering if you would speak to those issues. Thanks.
Okay.
I have thought about the problem of checks and balances, and I think it's one of the weaknesses of, it's certainly one of the weaknesses of this proposal, that there seems to be a disaggregation of tasks, and not very much thought of the problems that disaggregation brings about. So that's my basic criticism of this piece. But I do think, as I said, I think that the problem that you're talking about has to do with the specific authority that people would have with respect to human rights violations. So in that, to be fair to Habermas, it could be that what he thought his task was to disaggregate these functions, and then it would be up, and that was the end of what he wanted to do. But I think the disaggregating of these functions, I think, leads to potential problems at almost every level. So that's the kind of argument that I'm making. So in Republican theory, for example, as opposed to the kind of liberal theory that he's using, there are checks and balances built into various kinds of social systems. So I think one reason to emphasize the Republican dimension is precisely that one of its strongest features is this capacity to internally check forms of power. And I think it's a grave weakness of his view that he doesn't do that.
Okay, well, those are questions that I could answer over the next hour and a half. I'll try and be brief. The two questions that I understood were, one, what's the relation of this turn toward nature and what Albina called a systemic perspective? And the other had to do with my own view of revolution. So let me try and answer. Marx lived in a time when there was a miraculous coincidence of relational and systemic concerns. Class issues and structural issues of organization of the economy were the same. They were merged. And so he could imagine, he didn't have to separate them out, and he could imagine a resolution of both the problems of class inequality and the problems of the structural impediments to human happiness built into the market economy as being resolved at the same time. And this situation was partly a function of the fact that technology really was not very much used in his day. What we think of as technology, modern technology, existed in factories and perhaps to some extent by the time of the Civil War in armies. But there was the rest of social life was not mediated by anything resembling a modern technology. There were artifacts, but they were craft artifacts. Now, today we live in a very different world in which what Albina calls it relational issues no longer coincide with the structural issues. And technology is spread everywhere, so that all the institutions of our society are mediated by technologies, by modern technologies. It doesn't matter whether it's education or medicine or leisure activities. So you read in the newspaper daily about, cruise ships that have problems, fires, or new MOOCs that are going to replace us in universities. Or there's always something, environmental pollution, explosions in chemical plants. I mean, it's endless. So we are... And these technologies do something that Marx saw the factory doing. That is to say, these technologies produce latent subjects. The latent subjects or latent communities, people who share the same problems and whose activities have common side effects, often negative side effects. So what the concept of revolution that Marx derived basically from the French Revolution, and which was reinforced by 1848 for him, that concept could merge then with the relational and the structural, the systemic. He had all three of these things in one package. It's wonderful. And but we can't do that. We can't merge them together. They have come into, so they're in loose relationship and misalignment, but they're not one single thing. So I think the shift in the Frankfurt School toward emphasizing the problem of the domination of nature comes exactly as you point out from the systemic level emerging as the relational level ceases to have the same pertinence and power to threaten capitalism. Then this other level, the structural level, comes forward, the systemic level comes forward, and they observed what I'm arguing here, that capitalism is no longer simply a matter of factories, but technology is everywhere. They especially emphasize the technologization of communications, right? And this fact about technology, I think this is what leads them to the problematic of the domination of nature, the fact that the systemic level is not just a matter of economic laws in some narrow sense, but is about the relationship of human beings to nature. They went back, in a sense, to the way Marx talked about economics in the German ideology as a form of life, not the sort of thing that economists study, but the sort of thing we're interested in. And so then the second part of your question has to do with whether we've outlived revolution somehow. Well, could there be a merging again of... I don't think we can answer. I don't know. I mean, we can't. I think that it's wrong to simply discount the possibility, because in 1968, in a developed country, a very wealthy country, there was a revolution, and workers put red flags out in front of factories that they occupied and demanded socialism, and there was disorder everywhere. The government ministries were on strike, the universities, everything. And it was really because of the threat of civil war that peace returned. What would have happened had the revolution succeeded, I don't know. There's no way to know. Could it have actually constructed an alternative to the system that we know and love called advanced capitalism? Well, I don't see, I mean, it's very easy to be skeptical, but then one is skeptical in front of every significant advance, right? It's only reasonable to follow your common sense, which then binds you to the existing system. So I can't answer. What I do think, though, that's why I titled my book Between Reason and Experience. What is happening is that the rational forms, the reified rational forms, are proving their inadequacy over and over and over. And the feedback from reality comes from experience, people's experience of life and of the ways in which their lives are damaged and interfered with by the failures of bureaucracies, of technologies, of markets, of the foundations of modern capitalism. And the interaction between people who now react more than they used to, and in very dispersed ways and in ways that we don't even think of as political, and yet which are really political in this enlarged sense of political that I think belongs to a world that's totally technologized, totally rationalized. This is what is happening. That's what's real now. And so we need to understand it, theorize it. And I have great regret that in political theory, there's no democratic theory of this. It's odd. There's no democratic theory. The Frankfurt School has become ever more remote from these kinds of practices that reflect the conflict between the rationalized forms of society and people's lives. So I would like the Frankfurt School in its most recent form to come back to this and to start talking about this, because this is what's happening in medicine and with environmentalism and the area of communication and the internet and so on. I want this to become, again, a subject of reflection. If we can get over the hump of the problems in the original Frankfurt School formulations of the concept of nature and the critique of science and so on, then maybe we can make this kind of critique live again.
Alessandro.
Well, again, also here, two great papers, and thanks for all the enlightening stimulations. But I'll concentrate just on Jim's paper and ask him some questions. One has to do with Rawls's minimalism. You presented a picture where you have a minimalist version of what a world order could be, and then a more kind of maximalist one with Held and the idea of a cosmopolitan democracy, and Habermas trying to steer a middle course. And the first question has to do with why is the Rawlsian one a minimalist one, because there are more minimalist ones, or to take Ignatieff, for instance, or take Michael Walzer, without going to the realists, staying with the normativists. But you can think of Walzer's model in Governing the Globe, which questions somehow the idea of a global center. And one could make a claim that in Rawls, in Law of Peoples, you have basically an aggregate of peoples that make up a kind of composite metademos motivated by considerations of justice on the global scale, and what this and the space, the object of these considerations of justice have to do with respect for human nature, for human rights, with non-interference, with respecting pluralism, and there is no redistribution, but the model could be modified and enriched. Thomas Pogge, for instance, has added a redistributive aspect to it. So why is this presented as minimalist? The second thing is how you describe Habermas's change from an earlier stage in the 90s to a kind of model of a world order where you have a three-level, a national level with democratic legitimacy, a transnational level with fair negotiation, and then a supranational level with a political constitution of a world society which extends the pacifying function of law, and so on and so forth. And you take this as a kind of compromise with a realistic picture, and you present that constitution, that world constitution, as basically a liberal constitution.
He says liberal.
He says, okay, but and as opposed to a Republican constitution. And here I have one question about what is the distinction there between what you call a Republican constitution, and you present it here as a Republican constitution, and the maximalist program of cosmopolitan democracy. What is there the difference between the two? Because I have, it's not entirely clear to me. And the other thing is that it seems to me one of the strengths of defending here Habermas for once, it seems to me that one of the strengths of the middle of the road course, or the Rawlsian one, is the idea of, or actually what stands in the way of the maximalist program of cosmopolitan democracy is not a realist consideration of what could work, but is rather a sincere respect for pluralism. That's the rationale in Rawls for having two separate instances of the original position, one with the liberal peoples in the plural, and one with the decent societies, the decent people running in sequence, as opposed to having just one as the foundation for the legitimacy of the global scheme of governance. So the rationale there is respect for pluralism. The fact that the basic assumption of free and equal citizens is not shared across the border. Freedom, yes. Respect for human rights, yes. Equality across the board is not shared within decent societies. The equality of certain rights, of freedom of speech or freedom of conscience, and so on. So the fact that there's not shared ground is what motivates, in a way, a different model of democracy, or a different understanding of the democratic making of a world order at the supranational level. And I think Habermas has finally kind of embraced that view, and the rationale. I wonder why isn't that in the picture? That the rationale is the fact that as democracy obviously had to adjust to the change of scale from Athens to Washington or to Westminster, and the fact of the physical impossibility of gathering the demos in the agora and deciding directly, and you have to have representative democracy. It seems that in Rawls's view, at the supranational level, or at any level beyond the nation, whether it is the regional, the European Union, democracy in Brussels, let's say, or it is the cosmopolitan version, you don't have the unity of the demos on basic fundamental premises, and you have to accommodate that kind of pluralism. So there are reasonable principles rather than realistic accommodation to the realities of the international scene that are behind the model. And but then the basic question is, why wouldn't the Republican one that you advocate be just another version of the cosmopolitan democracy program?
I think Rawls's basic view is not as you characterize it. So that's a modified version of it, and it looks like one part of Habermas's approach if it were properly modified. But I think Rawls's conception of the obligations that peoples have towards each other is significantly limited, and in that sense, I don't think it addresses the kinds of issues that are necessary in a society in which, as I said in the beginning of the paper, a lot of issues are created by the emergence of all kinds of forms of power and new types of interventions that people can make in the natural and social world. So I think so in my view, that I think the Rawlsian view is minimalist. There's statements about, that they may have obligations to aid, but I think it's not. The Rawlsian view cannot answer the sort of problems that I think are already present in the world system. So in my view, it's just not. It's not the best way to start, and it certainly while it's democratic internally, it's not democratic externally. It's just, and same with as it is for people like David Miller. So they think there are particular kinds of obligations that they have, and they're very limited. What I agree with Habermas about is that we need the proper institutionalization of various kinds of structures, and without them, the basic problems of the sort that we face now are only going to get worse. So my criticism of it is just that I don't think it's not constructed for the proper purpose, which is that it's constructed as a kind of almost like a alternative to the UN structures. But what I think it has to be organized in such a way that it can face with it makes it possible to face with problems that are across borders and not simply within borders, and it's not a question of duty to aid and things like that. That there are the problems that his institutionalization is extensive enough. It just doesn't have the proper structure. I think the good thing about Habermas's views is that it's extensive, but some of it's baffling to me. Like, why would you say that one of the in this institutional structure that it should deal with the traditional issues of international law in the sense of having to do with human rights. While that's true, that it doesn't seem to me in this case in this case either that the structure that he has in mind, for one thing, that there's no discussion of what kind of limitations there are on that structure. There's very little discussion of what the scope of authority is, which maybe just means that it's an open question. But I think there are significant differences, and the reason why I appeal to republicanism is that I think republicanism, contrary to the kind of liberal constitutionalism that is much broader, and builds in it certain kinds of checks and balances, which I discussed in the earlier question. So I think Habermas is right in the scope of the project, but I don't think it's right in how the project gets articulated internally. I think that it lacks the basic capacity that you would need in order to have a capacity to exercise legitimate authority.
Albina.
Andrew, just a remark. I can't wait to lay my hands on your book, so no question to you. But Jim, I wonder. Let's try to clarify the nature of the shift. What is really being shifted in Habermas? I suspect, recalling the text of The Perpetual Peace of Kant, that there are two notions of democracy there, and Kant endorses one vis-a-vis the concern of peace in the world rather than freedom. Let me explain. So Kant distinguishes between forma imperii and forma regiminis. Forma imperii concerns the organization of sovereignty, how power is organized. And there the distinction is between democracy and monarchy and aristocracy. So how sovereignty is organized. When he talks about forma regiminis, it is about the way power is exercised. Not how it's organized, but how it's exercised. And there he distinguishes between a republican and a despotic way of exercise of power. So I wonder if Habermas is actually not shifting from the democratic form of organization of power that secures liberty because it gives self-authorship of the laws without guarantee of the result of what liberty would deliver, to kind of a safer form of democracy that we can say it's not so democratic because there is no self-authorship, but through checks and balances and through other means, it secures that the outcomes would be in the interest of the demos, even if the demos doesn't self-legislate.
It self-legislates even, it's not, the normal notions of self-legislation still exist. So I'm sure that people elect their representatives and so on still in
right, but it is not so important when Kant wants to stress that difference between the way you organize power and the nature of the exercise of power. So there, the self-legislation doesn't have such an important part to play.
Yes, I think that's right.
And maybe Habermas is shifting also in his notion of democracy towards that one.
Certain of those institutions that he is articulating now would fit would fit Kant's model very well.
Okay.
So that in effect it creates a level of organization which is relatively independent.
Yes, but then let's recall that the concern of Kant in that piece is not with freedom; it is with peace. And maybe also Habermas's problem is shifted from freedom to just peace.
Yeah. No, actually that seems right. That the reason why you have the separate entity would be for the sake of peace. Yeah. So that seems correct. Okay. All right, however,
so I've understood.
So I think that's a right. That's a right interpretation. That's a right interpretation of what Habermas is doing.
Okay, I've never read that part of his work very carefully, so I'm just.
Well, just in general because of the role that peace plays in this distinctive form of organization. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it is outsourced to one dimension of world society. So.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Eduardo.
Eduardo Mendieta. I'm still Eduardo, so I don't know whether to ask first Andy or Jim, but let me see if I understood Jim's paper at the end, which is really provocative. So you are suggesting that there seems to be a problem in Habermas's call for the constitutionalization of international rights. Law. And that this suffers from a deficit of the interaction between immanence and transcendence. But here's another way of looking at Habermas's work. If we go back to between facts and norms, there he argues about the co-originality between sovereignty and rights of citizens, right? That they are co-originary in the foundation of an order of law and democracy and so on. It seems to me that carries over into his analysis of the constitutionalization of the cosmopolitan order, insofar as he thinks that something like human rights are a precondition for juridifying international roles, international relations. And so I'm thinking here of the essay, Human Rights as a Realist Utopia. And it seems to me that when you have this at the international level, a co-originary of human rights, and then an attempt to juridify international relations, you have then this immanent transcendent dimension that also happens at the level of nation states. Is that making sense?
You have these because this kind of...
Well, for instance, in the essay, Habermas's essay on human rights as the realist utopia, there he sees human rights actually as being engaged in this immanent transcendent dialectic. Insofar as they create the conditions of possibility for then different subjects located in different positions to bring their grievances at an international level and then further fill in the claims of human rights. And so he talks about the dialectic between human vulnerability and suffering, and then the discourse of rights that enables that to be talked about and then create a process of further juridification.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that model. It's just whether the institutions as he imagines them to be not when he's talking about what the purpose of human rights are and how that might be institutionalized in specific cases. But it seems to me that there's still a problem with the institutionalization of human rights. The very same problem is repeated, but it's just at a different level.
I see.
I could grant you everything that you say at that level, and there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, I admire that part of Habermas's account of human rights. It's the role that these higher order institutions play. Right. Yeah. I think that's problematic.
Okay, I see. But then that's not a problem about the absence of an immanent transcendence. That's a different problem. It's a problem of detailing how that interaction actually pans out. And I think that he's been relatively humble, parsimonious, insofar as he wants those structures to develop out of an international dialogue, and that's what the call for a constitutionalization of international relations is about. It's to then have that kind of international debate that then is going to become deliberative, and out of that deliberation then you create the consensus, the communicative power that then creates an international community committed to them. But that's...
I think that's the project of having the kind of juridification of international law that's what I take to be the immanent and transcendent position. So in this particular case,
okay.
So I take that to be, but I think it doesn't. Perhaps Habermas doesn't think about it this way, but it's not. It seems to me that's where it should be present, and it's not.
Okay, I see. Okay, I'll save my question for Andy. It seems to me it's beautiful. I can't wait to read the book. But what about the linguistic turn, right? I mean, what about the critique of that we're still caught up in the productivist paradigm, that we have the subject-object relation, one which we now recognize is just, is just abbreviated understanding of a more fundamental relation, which is of the subject-subject already embedded in a language. And so if you can comment on that very briefly.
That's a huge question. Not having made the linguistic turn personally, I may not be qualified to answer. I went the other way. But I guess I'm skeptical about the idea that we can somehow evacuate the level of facticity by this. It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle for me. I mean, everything is mediated by language. There are structures of intelligibility without which there's no sense, right? So there's not some sort of empiricist basis to experience. The object is not something out there that's meaningless and that we encounter as a completely external reality. Maybe that far I've turned, but there must be some concept of facticity of the first person encounter with the real, which is an embodied encounter. It's not simply a linguistic phenomenon, and how that gets worked out, I haven't really figured out yet. But it has to be incorporated. Otherwise, we have no. I mean, at the worst, we end up like Laclos and Mouffe, with a theory in which there's no special reason why Jews wouldn't be Nazis and why women should be feminists, and because there's no facticity at all. So it's totally arbitrary how the meanings are distributed among human experiences. But I don't believe that. I think there's something that we need to reflect on that isn't absorbable into this communicative or linguistic turn. And the medium is a large part of the message, but it's not the whole message. Yeah. So that's my response. But that's the agenda for some new book that I have to write.
Thank you all for these 2 days and for everything that you've given us. And to our speakers.